We are Chris Lee and Blake Lovell of Southeastern 14, coming to you from Media Day in Nashville, our hometown, where I am here. Blake was here earlier. He's back at his home studio. Blake, let's talk about Greg Sankey today. He spoke for maybe 30 minutes this morning. There were really about 3 or 4 big topics. I would say NIL was a huge topic, probably the biggest. Gambling was a topic. Divisions and schedules were a topic. Really, if you want to lump those into two, that would be one. But I think the big thing today, a lot of time spent on NIL. And in that time, it was very clear to me. I mean, he said this many times. They are really wanting Congress to step in and do something about NIL to the point that everybody has a level playing field. I would say that hope might be misplaced, but it was interesting to hear Greg Sankey continue to plead towards lawmakers for answers with NIL.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that was the obvious point. You and I were kind of sitting there, and the number of times you and I could have elbowed each other every time we heard NIL, NIL, NIL. I mean, that's what we expect. I mean, I think it's just like you said. I think it's very clear. That's the notes I have. It's very very simple. Wants Congress to step in on NIL. Like that is the note I have at the very top of Greg Sankey's list here. And yeah, I mean that was I think the obvious point. And we know we're kind of in a new era now over the past, couple of years. NIL, talk about the online gambling and just how many states it's sort of legalized in now. And he was talking a lot about just wanting kind of laws in place really to be able to protect. Because I mean, you and I see it all the time, right? Like we're not on social media a ton, but when we are on social media, we see it. Like people, getting threats because I bet on this team and this happened. And it's the nature of social media, but he was very big on that. I thought that was something he really stressed, was wanting individual states to really put something in place to be able to protect these groups of people, whether it's coaches, players, officials. That was a big talking point for him. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that was, again, tying those two together, NIL and gambling, it all comes back to money, right? And I think those were the two biggest things I thought for him was to make it clear Congress is who he's looking at to sort of fix this problem with NIL and sort of the wild, wild west there. And yeah, trying to put some kind of stuff in place just based on kind of the explosion of gambling and what that could mean, good and bad, I think.
Well, if you wanted to tie a common thread on everything, I think the theme of today was almost outside influence. It's we've got these outside influences with collectives and middlemen or agents or whatever in terms of NIL. He referred to that many times today.
Yeah.
He talked often about outside influences in gambling and people getting yelled at, on social media for outcomes of games, officials having to deal with threatening voicemails, things showing up there at their places of business, that kind of stuff. I say things showing up, not like bombs or anything, but I mean messages directed towards their workplace or something like that, I guess. He didn't get really specific, but you can only imagine. And then when it got to expansion, even, I thought he made it very clear that they are fine with 16, but they've got to be aware with what the world around them does too. So it was just kind of like this constant theme once they got past the brag state. And they've got a lot to brag about. They talked about the championships and other sports, attendance, all those things. And that was great. That's kind of how he let off. But from then on, it was kind of like this whole series of all these other things we've got to deal with that are probably making him lose sleep at this point.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the quote I put on our social media, 14 Southeastern on Twitter. I think he was talking about how he views the SEC already as a super conference now with Texas and Oklahoma joining the mix. And I think he's right. It is a super conference now that you add those two to the mix. And so you got 16 and basically was saying, what about the potential expansion beyond that? The quote that I have here, and this is pretty close, I would say, to what he said. He's like, he asked himself the question, do I think it's done? And then he said, well, it appears that others are going to decide that before we have to make any decisions. So essentially, it's, what are these other schools going to do? What are the other conferences going to do? And then if something falls in their lap, then okay, then we have to make some decisions there and decide if we want to continue to go forth with this. But I thought there were a lot of things he said like that today, and we expect that, right? It's what do you see now? What's in front of you? Like it's not you're going to ask all the questions trying to get the future, but he is very good, I think, at just keeping it on what's in front of you. And
Yeah.
I think he was very focused on that. Just with we're at 16, that's where we're at. Another question I thought he sort of had the same thing on, which you and I both know, I think there's a good chance Nashville will eventually get an SEC football championship game, right? But he's like, no, our focus is on Atlanta. Like it was Atlanta. We're extending our deal with Mercedes-Benz Stadium. Um, and basically the focus was we put basketball in Nashville for however many years. We put all this other stuff, right? And so, yeah, so I think that's, he's very focused on what he sees in front of him. And we love to speculate. We love to have fun with it, but I don't think he's going there when it comes to kind of looking at that kind of stuff when it, again, when you just kind of look at it from that standpoint. So
Yeah, he did say that, but there was one thing at the end because he basically said when he was asked, no, we're pretty happy with Atlanta, but he threw in one thing at the end. I don't know if you noticed it. He said, but what Nashville is doing is opening us up to possibilities, meaning,
right.
of course, the new stadium. So, and look, this is, we're biased, but Nashville's kind of become a big center for a lot of things SEC. It's probably closer to the geographic center, and especially as the conference moves westward and all that. We're very biased. We would like everything in Nashville, but it was interesting to hear him say that. I think I kept my ears on that. I think he did mention media days will be in Dallas next year, I believe.
Yeah.
So that will open it up to the western frontier of the conference, which should be interesting. Also, there were people here today from Oklahoma and Texas covering those
a lot
media
more
markets
next year
today.
Yeah.
yes, there will. Blake, any parting thoughts on what Greg Sankey had to say today?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you're watching, you can watch on the SEC Network and see a lot of stuff. But we've just kind of given some overall thoughts. He talked about sort of just the elimination of the divisions, and he was talking about that, which we've heard before. That discussion, he's like, that goes back to what 2018, 2019 when they were first kind of considering that, and now when you have two teams added to the mix, it just the elimination of the divisions. It is what it is. We all knew it would get there. He kept bringing up the phrase fair and balanced in terms of the schedule. I know that fan bases will run with that and think what they will about whether certain schedules are fair and balanced. But look, you know what? He did say something in that. And the first thing I thought of was the conversation you and I had when we broke down the 2024 SEC schedule. He said, when I look at the 8-game schedule, and this is kind of expanding further beyond the divisions, but talking about that 8-game versus 9-game, he said, when I look at these 8-game schedules, I'm already thinking, wow, that's a tough schedule, right? If it's team A or team B. And you and I kind of said the same thing. We're like, well, yeah, we get that everybody wants 9 games, but man, when you look at some of the 8-game schedules, you're like, that's already a brutal schedule. And when you add one more of those SEC games to the mix, so I think he said kind of with not going with the 9-game schedule. I'm looking at my notes here. Basically, he said there were a lot of issues. One of the bigger elements was non-conference, but he also brought up just kind of, navigating NIL and stuff like that, I think was just sort of the changing, and the college football playoff. That was the other thing he brought up, just the expansion of that. So I almost feel like we knew those were the answers we would get, but it's sort of the delay and make that decision the following year when you have to. And so, certainly by this time next year, I think we'll have a very clear idea of what the schedule will look like the following season. But yeah, I mean, as always, people talk about Greg Sankey. They can say all these different things, and we know people like to tag him on Twitter when it comes to officials and those kind of things. But I mean, he always sends a pretty strong message about where things are at with the SEC, and I think it's a very easy to interpret. Like he doesn't, I think, leave a lot to interpretation. Like he kind of says, I think, what he's thinking at the time, and I think that's always been something that sort of stood out with him. So, yeah, I mean, the usual stuff that we all expected, NIL schedules, and all that stuff. That was the main focus there for Greg Sankey today in Nashville.
All right, lots of coverage from here in Nashville of SEC Media Days. We'll be here wall to wall, so be sure and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss anything from our channel. He's Blake Lovell. I'm Chris Lee. We're Southeastern 14, back with more content from Southeastern Conference Media Days very soon.